The Creatives with AI podcast.
Welcome to the Creatives with AI podcast. I'm your host, David, and in today's episode, I chat with Dan Clarke, Head of Technology and Innovation at the Greater Cambridge Partnership in the UK. We start off our conversation by discussing the current hype cycle around AI and how it's similar to past cycles. We then move on to how Cambridge currently uses AI to improve the day-to-day lives of its citizens. And finally, we explore the tricky balance of collecting useful data while maintaining anonymity for people just going about their day. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this friendly conversation with Dan.
The Creatives with AI podcast. The spiritual home of creatives curious about AI and its role in their future.
Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, David. Really good to be here.
How you doing? How are things in Cambridge these days?
Yeah, good. Really busy. Really looking forward to this conversation. Obviously, AI is something that we're thinking about at the moment. You know, it's the hot topic. So yeah, really looking forward to speaking to you.
AI might have come up once or twice in the daily discussions, I have to say.
Yes.
Actually, before we even get stuck into the conversation, it might be good maybe if you just gave a little bit of your background to people so they kind of understand where you're coming from.
I'm the head of technology and innovation for an organisation called the Greater Cambridge Partnership, delivering the city deal for the Greater Cambridge area. So that's a government funding stream. When the city deal was first signed and the Greater Cambridge Partnership was set up, one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that we were harnessing kind of new and emerging technology and data to really support the wider programme. So we built the programme from there, primarily focused on transport, but in previous roles, I've looked at how we can support service transformation through the use of sensors and data, and we continue to do that. I think the interesting thing is that I've been through a number of hype cycles, smart cities, IoT, and so really trying to, at the moment, work out, where the value lies in AI. And is this just another, bit of hype, or actually is there something in it that we can harness and, really help to transform place and the way that we deliver services?
What's your verdict on that, do you think? Where do you think we are in the hype cycle?
Well, there is a lot of hype. So I think we're almost on the top of the hype curve. I think... I really do think that there is something in it that could be quite transformational in the way that we've not really seen with smart cities or IoT. I think the question is how we harness it, and how we harness it in a responsible and ethical manner. And, I think there's some big questions around that. And obviously, as a listener to your podcast, I know you've had numerous discussions about that. But I think particularly for local authorities, that's a real issue, because actually, we don't have the skills to really, I think, understand some of these really complex technologies.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think one thing I want to just put out there for everybody listening is that Dan and I know each other pretty well. We've worked together on a few projects over the years, and we both are special interest group champions in the Smart Cities group at an organization called Cambridge Wireless. And so we talk a lot about smart city and IoT and how comms factors into that and that whole side of the world. So we actually know each other quite well and talk about this quite often. So I just wanted to put that in, because I'm sure it will come out in the conversation somehow, that if we start going down some rabbit hole and talking about something that maybe no one knows, that's probably why. So are you doing any, let's just jump straight in. Are you guys doing anything in Cambridge with AI at the minute? What's the plan?
So we are using machine learning. We're using it in a couple of ways at the moment. Over probably the last few years, we've been looking at the data that we need as a city to be able to kind of make the right decisions, whether that's modelling, whether that's policy decisions, or actually whether it's evaluating, investments that we've made in infrastructure. And the data that we were collecting or in the past generally never really gave us the information that we needed. So it would have been collected through things like loops in the roads, which, gave you vehicle counts, but you couldn't really get a granular understanding of the different classifications of vehicles, of cyclists, of pedestrians, which is really important now because sustainable transport is the big thing. We want to get people cycling and walking. So we really need to understand how our investments are shifting those behaviors. We were using Bluetooth sensors, and I think this is quite an interesting kind of case study of, technology promising something and completely under delivering. So we invested in the Bluetooth network. We were told that we would be able to tell the difference between cyclists, pedestrians, and vehicle, drivers of private cars. And actually, what the company was doing was looking at the bottom kind of 5% of trips. So as you went past one of the units, it would, record that you had been passed because it picked up your Bluetooth signature, and then somewhere else in the network, it would then record that you'd gone past another unit and work out your journey time. And their assumption was that the bottom 5% of people were all cycling and walking because they were the slowest, people traveling. And actually, at that point, we had about a 40% mode share of cyclists, and they were all traveling a lot quicker than car drivers because all the car drivers were queued up. So it was a completely false assumption, and actually the data that we were getting out of it just wasn't very good, wasn't very accurate. And then there are other ways that you can get data, mobile phone data, but again, doesn't really give you the modal split. So quite some time ago, we started working with a spin out from the university called Vivacity, who use low resolution cameras, all on edge kind of processing, machine learning, and it identifies different things in the environment. So I think they're up to about 30 different classifications now. Cyclists, pedestrians, it can tell cargo bikes. I think they're looking at e-scooters at the moment, different classifications of cars. And then it sends the data back, into the cloud, and we can access that through a portal. So it gives us a much better understanding actually of who's there, who's in the environment. So we are using their machine learning, so that's one kind of example of AI. And an extension of that, actually, we're using their sensors to see if we can better operate our traffic signals. So if you understand what vehicles and who is in the environment when you're looking down from a traffic signal, actually, can you better manage all those different actors within the environment? And, depending on what your policy is at a junction, you might want to give extra time to cyclists, you might want to give extra time to pedestrians, or actually you might want to, improve the flow of traffic through that junction. So it just gives you more options, and that's a practical application of AI that will hopefully make a difference to travellers in Cambridge. The second one is very similar. It's a company called Starling who are using the same low resolution cameras on crossings, and they can see who's in the environment and who's approaching the crossing as well. So if there's somebody who has got a kind of physical impairment, it might take them a long time to cross the road, we can actually change the crossing timings to make sure that they've got plenty of time to get across. If there's lots of people waiting, again, we can change the timings. And then you can do really clever things like if you had a sequence of junctions, you can begin to platoon pedestrians, which might sound strange, but if you start to clump them together, you can actually get them through on a green wave so they don't have to kind of stop. And that idea obviously improves walking and will make being in the city and walking around the city a kind of a much more pleasant experience. So those are two really, I think, relatively basic applications of machine learning, but that are making a real kind of difference. The third kind of area where we're really beginning to and have used AI is in the application of automated vehicles as part of the public transport system. And we ran a pilot for about 6 weeks, about a year and a half ago, and we're now part of a government-funded project which will see a huge expansion of that onto 2 sites in Cambridge. The plan is to have about 13 vehicles, and obviously they're really sophisticated. They do use machine learning to see what's in the environment, and they do use AI, and that's quite a challenge for us because they're really sophisticated.
Yeah, there's some great examples, I think, in Cambridge, and I think you guys have done a great job so far of being cautious, but yet using the technology that's available. 2 things came out of of those things that you were talking about that I do just want to point out quickly.
Yeah, sure.
One is we don't have any relationship with any of the products that we mentioned on the podcast. So we're not supporting anyone. We're just talking about the tools that we use. So don't worry about that. And the other one is maybe, and I know the answer to this, but it might be good for you to point out, is there's probably some people wondering, you've talked about Bluetooth and you've talked about the Vivacity cameras and stuff. And it's like, oh, okay, well, what are they looking at and what are they recording? Can you talk a little bit about the type of data that's stored and, more importantly, not stored from the cameras and those sorts of things, just so people can feel a little bit more okay about the fact that these cameras are in place?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a real concern and kind of live issue for us actually about the cameras that we're using. So they are low resolution. You can't really pick up somebody's face. You just see objects in the environment. All the processing happens on the edge, and the machine learning algorithm will classify the objects, and then the data is sent back, and then the video is destroyed. So it's not stored anywhere. Obviously, cybersecurity is a real issue because we don't want people hacking into them and being able to use them in any way. So we work quite closely with the companies. We've also worked with the Centre for Cybersecurity. They've got a Smart Places document, which is really interesting and sets out, how you can ensure that you're cyber safe. So, we work with other agencies to make sure that we are secure, that we're acting in an ethical manner. The one thing I would say though is companies want to download some video so that they can train their models. And that's, we have discussions around that, about how that data is then used, and actually at the end of it, how it's destroyed, to make sure that, it can't be used for any nefarious kind of activities. I think that the two things to say really are, we know that there are concerns, and we're looking at ways that we can begin to engage with local communities and kind of draw them into conversations around this. We wanted everyone to know what we were doing, so we contacted the local paper and we ran a story saying we're working with a company who are using machine learning on the crossing, and what we're really trying to do is improve the public experience. So as a citizen in the city, this is all about making things better for you. We thought that it would be a small little article on page 8, but actually they put it on the front cover of the local paper. AI comes to Cambridge.
Love it.
Yes, it wasn't quite what we were expecting. But from that, and we don't know whether it's actually related to that, or actually Cambridge has been going through a process of looking at congestion charge, and whether people thought these were camera infrastructure that was being put in for charging. But we have experienced vandalism.
Interesting. Yeah, I know London has a particular problem with the vandalism of the cameras at the minute around the expansion of the low emission zone, don't they?
They do, yeah. And
it's quite an interesting challenge. I obviously I've done some work with you guys in the past, and I've done some work with Oxfordshire County Council as well, and it's a really delicate balance, isn't it, between being able to get information and data that you can use to make everybody's lives better, but then also maintaining that anonymity as well. I mean, obviously there's a lot of rules around, again, just for people listening, they're not taking your car reg number and they're not identifying what vehicle it is, and they're not keeping that data. They literally the AI tools can do it just by looking at it. It can tell what type of vehicle it is, that sort of thing. There's no tracking or anything like that. Even though it's possible, it's not doing it. This is the crux of the issue, isn't it? And the challenge from your side is, how do you, I guess you have to ask yourself, when we're working on those projects in the public sector, we have to say, okay, we really want to make people's lives better, but we have to be so careful and so transparent, and that's, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and, how do you, it's ensuring that transparency is there, that data security is there, those sorts of things, and that the anonymity is being maintained on one level, but also at another level that there's enough there to identify something if you need to remove it, which is something that came up in a conversation yesterday, which I hadn't really thought about. But they said, we use these tools. We have an AI tool. People talk to it. And I said, well, these are sensitive conversations. They need to remain anonymous and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, they do to a certain level. But then we also need to have enough to know that if they come back later and say, I want you to delete that conversation, I don't want anything about me in there, that we can actually go and remove it. So yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? It
is. I think the key thing for us is really understanding what the public value is of what we're doing and being able to articulate that up front. So, there is a real reason why we're collecting this data, and at the end of it, we will deliver some sort of public value, whether that's improved transport modeling, which means that we make better investments, that the transport system, works better, whether that's better traffic management or cycle or pedestrian management, which makes the environment safer. I think, having a really good idea of why it is we're doing what we're doing. I think transparency is really important. So we have an open data platform, and I personally would want to see data opened up and made available to the public to be able to look at the data that we're collecting, because, I think it's public data. We're collecting data on people in the city, so they should then be able to use that data. I think one of the issues for local authorities is that, funding is short, and there's always a temptation to think you can make money out of data. And so there are those conversations going on at the moment. But we do have an open data platform called Cambridgeshire Insights, and we've been putting the data up until this point onto that platform. And the reason why I say up until this point is because we've greatly expanded the footprint of the sensor network, and we've now got so much data that actually it's quite difficult to release it on that type of platform. And so we are working with another company looking at automating the uploading onto a transport data platform, and then hopefully we'll be able to put an API on there so that people will be able to come and use it. My only concern with that is that's great if you're a data scientist or you work in a tech company, but if you don't know how to use an API, how do you get that data? And actually then how do you analyze it, and how do you draw, some kind of intelligence out of it? So we've got to think about, I need my next door neighbor to be able, if he wants to see how many cars are at the end of the road and wants to use the data, he needs to be able to do that easily. He's not going to go in through an API and put it into a tool that he can kind of do that. So thinking about that, I think on the transparency front, we've started to work with, and one of the companies that we're working with is going to be filling this in for us. We've been working and having some conversations with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and the Central Digital and Data Office, so both government bodies, and they've put together something called the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard, which is a record of algorithms that are being used in the public sector. So it'll say why you're using it, kind of what kind of algorithm it is, how the data is processed, and then that will be a public record so that anyone can kind of go and see it and really understand what you're doing. So I think that's quite interesting, and we haven't completed a record yet, but we're hoping to get at least one of our schemes onto that register just to see how it works, and then obviously we'll do that for kind of all the schemes that we do. We make sure that we're complying with all data standards with GDPR, so just to make sure that we are being as transparent and ethical in everything that we do as we kind of can be.
Nice. I didn't even know about that, the algorithm thing, so that's quite interesting to know that that's there. I saw a presentation by a lady from Number 10, who's the head of data analytics for Number 10. And she talked a lot about how the data tools that they use aren't so much a black box as a lot of the other ones. ChatGPT and a lot of the large language models, nobody really knows what happens. You put a query in and it gives you an answer, and there's not really, as far as anyone can tell, any kind of a paper trail. Whereas the tools they use, they can ask it to do some sort of analysis on a piece of data, and it comes back and it gives them the answer, but then it also shows all of its work as well. So if they need to go back and understand exactly how that algorithm worked, they can find that and see that afterwards, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that's something we're going to have across public sector. And, if there are companies out there building AI tools for public sector, specifically for use in public sector, I think there's going to have to be much more of an audit trail that's available for exactly those reasons. And I'm totally, I didn't even know that was there. So that's really good to know. So I'll actually look that up for some of the stuff that I'm doing. That sounds really interesting.
So David, do you think that government will have narrow AI? Well, what I mean by that is specific AIs for specific tasks instead of a kind of a general AI.
Yeah. And I think at the minute, that's how I see AI in general. The market is splitting up already. I think there are, I've mentioned this before, but there are certain tools are better at certain things. Google Bard is very good at, if you need to get current information up to almost today from live websites, and you want it to go and pull back data, do some analysis, and then also show you the references where it got that information, it's the best tool to do that, which makes sense because Google has essentially, the search map of the entire internet. And so applying the AI to that totally makes sense. You can't get that from ChatGPT. It's not how ChatGPT was trained, and it's not what GPT is good at. ChatGPT is good at one thing. There's another one that I talk about all the time called Claude. Claude is amazing at other stuff like writing prose. So if you need to, I'm actually putting together a post to go on LinkedIn because I asked it something to help me write something the other day, and what it came back with was incredible. It was so good and so human, and it actually captured exactly what I was trying to say. And I was just looking for inspiration. I wasn't looking for it to kind of do it for me. I was looking for it to just help me. And I ended up using exactly what it said because it said exactly what I was feeling, which was really odd. So yeah, I think we will see specialist tools for different areas. I also think that we'll see we'll get tools that will be trained only on the government data. So you might get, I don't know, an HMRC AI that will be trained on all of the laws and rules and regulations around tax and corporation tax and all the other stuff, and anything that you could ever want to ask about tax, it will know inside and out. And so you'll be able to go to it, ask a question, and it will be able to give you an accurate answer because it isn't making anything up, because it's only been trained on the actual data that's in there. And I think that's where it's going to be really important. And these tools are going to be different than the tools that you find on the open market, because those tools are trained on everything.
So, I mean, we both worked in the local authority kind of sphere. The thing that I wonder is going to be an issue is the actual background data that you train those models on, because, as you know, the organizations haven't really been data driven up until recently. We've only just really started to put in place a data strategy within the council, and people haven't really thought of data as an asset, and that it needs to be curated. And so I think there's quite a lot of work that we need to do to ensure that data is fit for purpose. We have to be really careful. In the transport sphere, it's not, bias is something that we consider, but, the types of data that we're collecting, I think it would be quite difficult to build kind of biases into that. But when you start getting into the health and social care area, obviously it's really, you have to be really careful. We don't want to build bias into the data sets that we'll be training on. And I just wonder whether we've got the kind of the skills that we need to be able to curate that data, to understand, the strengths and weaknesses of it, and to be able to identify actually biases before we let AI anywhere near it.
And then understanding what's a bias that we want versus what's a bias that we don't want.
Yes.
Because that's the trick, isn't it? We want it to actively have a bias in one direction or another, because maybe there's one group that, we want to bolster one group and we don't want to, we want to make sure that one group doesn't have too much of an advantage. We want things to be equitable. And so how do we do that in the tool? But then our idea of equitable is different than, someone else's idea of equitable. And how do you navigate that? And that's that bleeds into the ethics and all of it. I had a gentleman on not too long ago named Sharon Matthew, and Sharon, talked about ethics, and the way he likes to think about it is the framework. It's more of framework, I think, in a way you look at each individual project that you're working on to try and understand, is this the right way to do this particular project? And you try and work it out, at the time, each individual way. But it's a huge challenge. I mean, it's a huge challenge. And like, working in public sector, you will never be right any of the time. Like, you can never make everybody happy. It's not going to happen, and it's impossible. And this actually, thinking about that, makes me want to go back to something you talked about earlier, which was the sort of the autonomous vehicle trials. How are those going in Cambridge? Because I've seen a lot of press in other cities where people are like really not happy with them, and they use orange cones to like block them in so that they can't drive and stuff like that. So I'm curious about what's the reception been like? How have people felt about it?
So obviously people have concerns. The most important thing for us is safety. So the trial that we ran previously, we spent, considering we ran for 2 months, and actually that was foreshortened because of COVID. We were planning to run for 6 months, but there was a 2.5 year run up to that. And a lot of that was, doing safety cases, making sure that the vehicle was safe, making sure that the environment was safe in which it would be running, doing some kind of testing as well, working with the company to really understand what their processes were. So it got a really good reception from the public who used it. We did some survey work. We asked people what they thought of the experience, and generally really positive. But it was a very small trial. This is going to be a much bigger trial to ensure safety. I think, again, when we talk about skills within the local authority, we don't have the skills to be able to properly audit and understand what's going on that vehicle. So we have specialist companies who work in that area, who are helping us, and who will, testing the systems will be on the vehicle in a virtual environment before we move out into the physical environment. We'll be doing safety cases. The government has a program called CavPass that we'll be working with as well. So doing everything that we can to make sure that the vehicles run safely. But there are always going to be people who worry about having vehicles without a driver. And I think the thing to say at the moment, the legislative framework that we're operating in, there will be a safety driver in it. If we take the safety driver out, it will be remote operations. And there is a question about reaction time with remote operations and how quickly you can kind of, take over the vehicle. But there's a lot of work going on to kind of understand that and to put kind of mitigations in place to make sure that it's safely running. So in the trial, from what we understand, the kind of, the amount of time it's going to take to get new legislation through, it's unlikely that we will be running fully autonomously. But what we really want to do is engage the public to find out whether these vehicles actually really have a use, whether they would use them, how safe they would feel. Things like if you're using an on-demand automated shuttle and it's late at night, as a woman, would you feel safe getting on one? Would you feel safe sharing one? How do you protect revenues? How do you do ticketing? Kind of all that stuff will be exploring. And CCAV did a really great piece of work on human factors, where they went around to a number of places that traditionally haven't been involved in any of the automated vehicle work. They took a vehicle. They did a lot of work with local communities to try and, understand how they perceive the vehicles, whether they would use them. And that was pretty positive as well. So, I think we need to bring those communities along with us. We need to, and I've talked a bit about public value. I think that's really important. We need to get people to understand what the public value of these vehicles are. And, we are really thinking about public transport applications. So it'll be a long time, I think, before your number 5 bus that runs, every 10 minutes will be automated. I think initially we'll see these vehicles in kind of edge cases running on demand overnight, first, last mile. I think there are some other potential applications joining campuses up to railway stations. So, I think it's going to be a slow evolution, but, we need to sell the kind of benefits of this to communities. I think where it gets harder, in an area that we're not going to get involved in, I don't think, is the shared taxi space, which is what you kind of see in the States and a lot of the, Waymo kind of demonstrators. It's either private car or it's shared cars. And at the moment, that's not a space that we want to be in. Yeah.
So how long have you been, when was your first CAV discussion? How many years ago was that?
2016 was the initial discussion. One of the great things, as you know, David, of being in Cambridge is that it is full of technologists, most of them sane, some of them completely nuts.
Yeah.
And so, we were approached by somebody who was thinking about this, who said, right, you've got this guided busway, it's segregated, why don't we use that as a test track for, automated vehicles? And actually, there weren't really many around at that point. But we then found someone who was, quite well keyed into this world, a professor at the university. We did a piece of work looking at the guided busway. And then from there, we built, we've done 2, and this is our 3rd government-funded project. We've done work looking at, how humans interact with vehicles. We've looked at opportunities. We've got an automated vehicle strategy, which kind of sets out the advantages, the benefits, and then, potentially some of the sites that we could run on. So it's been a long evolution and kind of journey. Again, sometimes I think these are really have the potential to revolutionize transport, particularly rural transport. So you take the driver out, electric vehicle, reduce the operating costs. Can you make them commercially viable, which normal bus services aren't in rural areas? And is that a really big opportunity? And then other times I just think, I don't know. Why are we doing this? But I think, I think it would be a valid response from us as a local authority to get to the end of this process and say, actually, there's nothing in this and we've tried it. But what I'm hoping is that we'll find some real use cases which will add value to the public. But,
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, in particular autonomous vehicles, and there's a specific reason that I know it's slightly off, seems like it's slightly off the AI topic, and I do want to bring it back around because I think there's a point there. But while you were talking, I actually just had a quick nosy around on Google, and of course this is from Waymo, so they would say this, but their insurance data reveals there's a 100% reduction in the frequency of bodily injury claims and a 76% decrease in property damage claims by autonomous vehicles as opposed to human drivers, which is a really interesting stat. So I've always thought that if we could get to the point where we had, a certain, almost a tipping point with autonomous vehicles, that we would see an enormous reduction in the total number of accidents and everything else. But what's interesting is that I think people push back and they really don't want it. So we are seeing that in San Francisco. A lot of people are, like I said, they're blocking the cars, they're stopping them from operating. They already drive 20 miles an hour anyway, which is, nobody wants to use them because they're so slow that they're almost impractical to use. You had Toronto, famously tried to do their project with, I think it was with Google, and they were going to do some smart buildings and sort of, rejuvenate the docks area downtown or something. And basically everybody kicked off and went, no, we don't want all the sensors. We don't want all that stuff. So there's still a lot of work that we have to do, I think, as people who work in public sector and really trying to help people understand what this technology does and what it doesn't do. So the tie-in that I've been trying to get to is that, you've been working on this, 7, 8 years now.
Yeah.
It's not really, I mean, in a way it's progressed quite far, but in another way it's not progressed as far as you might have thought, as certainly as quickly as most other technology. So I suspect, and I'll be interested to get your thoughts, but I suspect we're going to see the same thing in AI. Everybody's talking about it. It's captured everybody's imagination. Yes, in some industries, it's making a huge difference, but in public sector, it's probably going to be decades before we actually see any real use of it. Is that what? Do you agree?
I do. I think, and I talked earlier about, I've seen a number of kind of hype curves, and if we take like the Internet of Things, when I first started in this kind of area of looking at the application of technology in kind of urban spaces, like 8-9 years ago, IoT was the big thing. It was going to transform everything, and everything would be connected to the internet. Sensors would talk to each other and would be able to pull data together and give you new and exciting insights, and it would change the way that we delivered services in cities. And actually what's happened is we've got some really good use cases for IoT, whether that's measuring movement, air quality, or, it can be silt build up in drains, all that sort of thing. But they're very siloed, and it's not the kind of the original vision for IoT. It's just practical applications of technology that, create savings, make it easier for people to do their jobs. And I think that's what will happen with the AI. Within the public sector, there's a promise that, it will change everything. And actually, it may just, change little bits of the organization in those kind of little silos that we've kind of talked about. I mean, I might be wrong.
Do you think that I mean, cities like Cambridge have massive problems because you're a very historic city, right? And you've got lots of buildings and things that are preserved, and you can't do this and you can't do that because of planning regulations and everything else. Do you see that as a particular challenge? Do you think that's slowing it down in Cambridge maybe more than other places? Or do you think it's just the same thing that everybody's seeing everywhere?
Doing things in Cambridge is hard. We've got a crazy governance system with 3 layers of government and the body that I'm part of kind of delivering, which makes decision making difficult. The historic nature of the city does make it difficult to trial things. That's why people use Milton Keynes. There's plenty of space, particularly for automated vehicles. But actually, when you look across Europe, most cities are like Cambridge, historic core, and then you might have, modern kind of development around it, campuses and kind of business parks and that sort of thing. So I think Cambridge is a really good place to test because, it is like a lot of other kind of cities. The one thing that we find quite difficult actually is a lot of space in cities is private. Our lighting infrastructure falls under a PFI, so effectively it's operated by somebody else. And just deploying stuff into the environment is difficult. Once you get into the centre, there's conservation areas and there's concerns about visual impact, of course, completely understand that. Planning is difficult. We've been working with, a telecoms provider who wants to put small cells on streetlights. Because we don't own the streetlights, the actual contract says you can't put telecommunications equipment on it. Then there's, everyone's worried about the visual impact, and so it does make things really difficult. I think where technology really helps, where you've got a historic city with a really kind of tight street pattern, is that it gives you opportunities to optimize flows of whether it's cyclists, pedestrians, whether it's cars, or, whatever it is you're optimizing. So you're squeezing the most out of this very tight, road pattern because you can't build your way out of it. So you've got to do other things. I mean, and the other thing is, obviously, Cambridge is the UK's capital of AI and, all things tech. So it has been amazing. It's got a really great network, as You can go to an event, you end up sitting next to somebody who's like a world leading expert on AI, and everyone is so generous with their time and they'll talk to you, and you can have some really interesting conversations. So it's a great place to do this stuff, and we should be doing it in Cambridge. And actually, the reason why we set up the program in the first place is like we've got the university doing great research on urban technologies. We've got all these companies doing this amazing stuff, and they all go off and test it in America or somewhere else. Why aren't they testing it on their doorstep?
Because of all the reasons you just mentioned.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, so let's change tack a little bit. So taking all that into account, what are the cool technologies that you see coming? Have you seen anything recently that you think, wow, that's actually pretty interesting and I'd like to see that, or something that you think would be really helpful or useful, particularly for, maybe a public sector like a local government to try and use to do something really good for the people?
So we just recently, over Christmas last year and kind of early into this year, ran a big consultation around the congestion charge, and there was about 23,000 responses. I think it might be more than that, but a lot of responses. One of the biggest kind of consultations that we've done in a long time. A lot of free text boxes, which in a traditional way you need to go through, code the responses, then work out who said kind of what, and it's a long process. And out to the end of it, you kind of get a report, but it's months and really expensive. Well, one of the things that we couldn't have done it this time because we just weren't set up, but one of the things that we had some conversations with people around was using natural language processing potentially in the future to be able to quickly analyze consultation responses. So I know that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but I think that can make consultations much more responsive, shorten the time between getting the responses and actually being able to put together an action plan and kind of deciding what you're doing. So that's quite interesting. There was a conversation that I was having with someone the other day about our complex or, governance-rich environment that we're kind of in, and that residents really don't know who to talk to, who does their bins, who's responsible for potholes, who's responsible for roads, who do I talk to, what are the rules, and actually, if I wanted to do something in my neighbourhood, how do I do that? I think it's so complex, people feel that they can't intervene and do interesting things in their kind of local areas. Could we have a single front end that uses AI to effectively crawl different organizations? So you ask it a question, I want to put a planter outside my house, in a parking bay. How do I do that? And then, it effectively gives you a response which says, right, this is the rules, this is how you do it, this is who you need to contact, this is the form that you need to fill in, or whatever it is, just to really ease the friction, that people experience and the frustrations of kind of working with government. So I think that would be really interesting. I think we're going to see machine learning, in some of the kind of tasks that we do. And there's a really interesting company that uses it for sorting waste. And I think, the big challenge for councils at the moment is, the pathway to net zero. And I think there are going to be huge applications for AI in the way that we build, manage kind of energy systems, manage the interaction between the energy system and things like vehicles, where you can use cars or buses as batteries, effectively, and you take a much more holistic approach to the way that you plan infrastructure. And kind of off the back of that, what's really interesting is we've done some work around digital twins with the university, and being able to bring lots of different systems, city systems, whether that's water, power, the transport system, together into one model so that you can really understand the interrelationships, I think really opens up the kind of possibilities for the way that you plan and deploy infrastructure, and more importantly, the way that you understand risk. So actually, if I understand that that there is a risk of flooding, and we understand from the sensors that we've deployed and the patterns that we're seeing that actually there's going to be a flooding event, and we understand the interrelationships between flooding and the potential failure of the power network, And then the impact that that will have on the transport system, because we've electrified it and all of a sudden there's no power, then that allows you to kind of put in place mitigations and really be able to plan in a kind of a much more holistic manner. And I think with climate change, we're really going to need to do that to understand, much more about how these systems relate to each other.
And building on your example, I think there's some really good, again, shout out to a particular company, but I think BlackBerry, who actually still does mobile, even though no one would know it. But they do a lot of things around, sort of blue light services and those sorts of things around if there is a flood, they're using AI in the background or some machine learning tools to actually know who are the right people to notify at the right time and who to reach out to for this particular thing, because it involves these, like, I don't know if you saw the other day, but there was like a recycling plant or something in Oxford that got hit by lightning and there was a massive explosion. And in an instance like that, you need to know, A, there's been an explosion, and B, what was it, right? Was it a hazardous chemical? And if it was, are there certain people that need to be notified over other people because, they're qualified to deal with that sort of emergency? Do you need certain things to send to emergency services? All that sort of stuff. And traditionally, that's been done manually. Right? Like, somebody calls the fire department and says, by the way, if you haven't seen it, this huge thing has exploded, next to my house. You might want to come and take a look. And then they get there and they have to figure out, what is this thing? What is this material? And there's all this delay. And, that thing could be burning for 10 or 20 minutes before they even figure out what it is. Whereas now, all of that stuff, the instantaneous almost response to those sorts of incidents, I think is another way that it could be used, that people don't. It sort of just happens in the background and people don't really think about, like, how do the police talk to the fire department and how do they talk to hazardous materials people and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's all sorts of, kind of, I would say, hidden ways that tools like that can be used to really help. And even the smallest things for people, like you said, and I've talked about this before, is if you call up the council and you need to get a parking permit and they say, well, you have to prove where you live. And you go, but I pay council tax. And it's like, why can't you take my council tax record? Because I pay for that, for the house. And they go, oh, no, I can't see that information. It's like, well, why not? And that was all from an old thing where one team couldn't see the data from another team. But now that we have the ability for an AI tool to maybe sit on top of that, then it should have the ability to dip in and out of those different things, because it's not a person that's looking at the data. So you could have those automated tools that are smart enough to be able to interpret the data that it's seeing and to kind of keep everything up to date without any single individual being able to access it.
So, we are, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think we're, techno optimists, and when we see, real value and kind of in how these technologies can be used to improve things. But in my experience, it's really difficult in the public sector and it moves so slowly. How do you think we can get from where we are to a point where we're really harnessing AI for good and doing the things that kind of you're talking about and that I've talked about, and it becomes embedded in our kind of day-to-day processes? What do you kind of think needs to happen to get to that point?
It's a great question. I think we need to start small, and we just need to build one example at a time. And we need to start with the small stuff, and it's not going to be hugely important, but we have to build trust. And the only way we can do that is by showing successful tools along the way with, it starts off with things that maybe aren't that, or seemingly aren't that important. But in your example, like being able to actually have a useful chatbot that you could talk to, that you could go and ask questions and it would interact with you like a real human would, and it would understand like a real human would. That would be a major success for most people, because at the minute, the limiting factor is you ask it a question and half the time it's a very blunt instrument. And if we can just do little examples along the way and start to test it, it's the same thing. It goes back to the example of autonomous vehicles. They all drive at 20 miles an hour at the minute because everybody's so worried that if it drives at 30 or 40 miles an hour that something tragic is going to happen. It's probably not, but everybody's like overly cautious. And everybody's overly cautious at the minute with AI, I think. And because nobody wants to be the one to have something major happen, right? Like nobody wants that on their head. So I agree with you. It's going to take a long time. I think something else that you've, talked about earlier is not only are people going to have to trust the AI, but we're going to have access to the data so that the AI can make a better decision. And I think we need to do a lot of work around helping people understand how AI uses data that it finds and how that then either gets used in models or not. And, really digging into that and understanding that and helping people be comfortable with how that works. And us as technologists being comfortable with how that works as well. And I think it's just going to be a slow process, but slow not in the 100-year time frame slow. It's going to be slow in the new world slow, which is 10 or 15 years. But I think it's going to be that hockey stick, right? It's going to be nothing, a little bit, and then all of a sudden everybody's going to realize that actually it's okay, and then it's just going to go off the scale. And that's the only way I see it working in public sector anyway. I think we'll see it. It'll work totally differently in the private sector, but in public sector, we really do have to just build up trust, not only with the citizens, but also with the people in the public sector. And they have to get trained up, and we're going to have to do a massive, you mentioned this earlier, but we're going to have to skill up everybody. And I don't know how, that's a bigger question. How do you skill up everybody to be able to understand what the tools are doing and how to use them? And
I think one of the things that we've thought about is when we're doing IoT deployments, particularly in sensors, when we're deploying a sensor, the person that we want using that sensor and the data isn't a data scientist. It's a road operative who needs to know when to clean a drain or something. So you need to make that process as easy as possible. If they're deploying the sensor, they just need to be able to pull out a tab and stick it onto something, and the data starts flowing, and they get an alert on a mobile phone when they need to go and kind of use it. And I think there are, so there are going to be two types of users within the local authority. Ones that I just think, the best will in the world are never going to be, digitally savvy enough to be able to really use kind of AI, understand the implications and that sort of thing. But actually having those tools is going to be really useful. And then, your kind of IT tech people who really need to have a really deep understanding and need to help and support those people in the way that they kind of bring it in. And it's just how you kind of bridge that gap. I think, how do you move from IT services to digital services? And what I mean by that is IT services at the moment put Microsoft 365 on your laptop, give you two screens, set you up on the network, whatever it is. But this is much more. I mean, this is a big breadth of technology potentially that you're kind of, putting in place. And they need to have a much greater understanding of a range of things, which I think the skills just aren't there. And I just don't know how you upskill your workforce meaningfully, because there's so much to do.
And I don't think anybody does at the minute. And I think that's one of the big, certainly that's one of the big questions. I mean, education is changing wholesale. This is going to have an enormous impact on education, how students learn, what access to information they have, how they're tested. It's really, and I've had several, sort of conversations about education already. I did the careers day with your friend the other day, and some of the kids are using AI in amazing ways already, which was genius, and using it to prepare for their exams. And they, one of the kids, for people outside I think I've talked about GCSEs before, but it's sort of like your high school finals, but it's a standardized test everybody takes in the UK, but they're all written answers. And so the thing is you can actually put the question in. As a student, you can put the question in, you can put your answer in, and then you can ask it to grade it using the grading rules that they would use for that exam, and say, suggest how I could improve this answer, and those sorts of things. And it literally, like ChatGPT, will go away and it'll come back and it will grade your answer, and it will give you strategies and tips on how to write a better answer. That's genius. Like, we never had, no students have ever had the ability to do that. It's always been, you took a mock exam and then your teachers graded it and kind of gave you an idea of what they thought. Now you can practice that answer 100 times every day if you want to. And it's gonna change everything.
It will do. And I think some people naturally jump to, well, we should ban the use of AI tools in schools. But I definitely don't think that's the right thing to do. I think we ought to be teaching children how to harness them to enhance their kind of learning experience. But one of the things that really concerns me is the use of AI and misinformation, particularly on social media. And we need to teach children to think critically about the things that they're seeing, to understand how AI can generate images and text, and to really drill down and try and understand whether the thing they're seeing is real or whether it's been generated for some other reason. And that kind of critical thinking, I think, really needs to be embedded in schools, because that's going to be a really important skill.
Totally agree. And I know they're doing it in Finland. So that's part of the curriculum already, is for them to understand how to analyze and interpret information that they see online to make some sort of a value judgment about whether they think it's reliable or not. And specifically, this is for people outside the UK. You probably don't know about this. And Dan, I don't even know if you know about this, but there's been this big storm over a recording that was allegedly over Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the Labour Party. And it's supposed to be a recording of him swearing at some aides and generally being rude. And what's really interesting is it's been analyzed by about 20 different people, and everybody that's come back have said that they all think that it's a fake recording. And they've used all the, sort of audio analysis tools, and it's been the most analyzed piece of probably sound ever so far. But it's a great point. And we're getting to the point where it's going to be, I think this will probably be the last election that we'll be able to rely on most of the information that we see. I think next time elections come around, and certainly in the UK and the US, because we're kind of along on the same election cycles now, I don't think next time we're going to be able to rely on any of it, because we just won't know what's real unless we see it with our own eyes. We're going to have to just assume that, if it's anything that's even slightly outrageous, we're going to just have to assume that it's fake, which is terrible, because maybe they are actually being totally outrageous and we should believe that. But we are rapidly approaching a post-truth world, I guess, is what they call it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
really concerning. I mean, it is really concerning. There will always be bad actors who use, technologies to disrupt elections, but yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I know I said I would tell you at 45 minutes, and we're now at an hour because I completely missed it. So we probably should think about winding up. I mean, I don't mind. We can talk if we can do a Joe Rogan and go 3 hours if you want to. So thinking about that, then that's an excellent segue though into, I talk a lot about and talk to people about, what's your version of the future? Are you a Star Trek kind of guy where you think of ultimately that this, even though we may have some growing pains along the way, we're going to end up in a more of a utopian type society where everything's going to be great? Or, are we going to go down the Mad Max road where it's all, we're just going to end up with no technology, but we're going to take, a step back about 300 years. And then I've had loads of people interject all sorts of variations in the middle. So you've got the sort of the she/AI world, you've got Dune, you've got cyberpunk, you've got all those different kind of dystopian kind of bits in the middle. Where do you think we're going to fall?
God. I'd like to be really optimistic and think it's gonna, it's gonna be we're heading towards utopia. But I really worry about the future. And I don't think it's just technology. Obviously, it's things like climate change, and so there's some big kind of existential things in the background that hopefully technology will come and save the day. But I've just seen too much hype in the tech space, and so I'd probably take a middle ground. I think technology will play a key role in helping to address things like climate change, and we're seeing some amazing kind of innovations in in the renewable energy space, and kind of all that sort of thing. So I think half of my glass is full with that. but the other half is empty with, disinformation, undermining democracy. I don't think AI is going to run away and kind of kill us all, but I think it could be applied in a way that really does some serious damage to society. I think at some point we need to decide actually what are the important things for us as a human, and we know what they are. It's not technology, it's friends and it's family, and it's living somewhere that you feel safe and secure, and you've got food and you've got water and electricity and all that kind of good stuff, and you lead a good life. And if technology isn't helping and supporting that, then what's it for?
Exactly. Okay. You and I've talked about this before, so I broadly agree with you. I think the risk is always people. And I think if AI if we are going to end up in a bad place from it, I think it will be from the socioeconomic fallout of having AI tools and things moving really quickly that we're not prepared for as a society. And I think there's potentially some fallout around that, and that's where the trouble will come. It won't come from AI directly. I don't think AI will try and kill us, although some people do, and that's fine, and I respect that.
Yeah.
So is AI male or female?
Wow. So that's an interesting question, and one that I've obviously heard discussed on your podcast before. And my natural instinct is that it's female, and I've really had to kind of question myself about why. Is it because I'm telling it what to do, and is that entrenched sexism in my in my personality? It's just the way that I kind of initially when I initially thought about it just female popped into my head, but I don't know why. Yeah. And so
could be because it gives excellent advice.
Well, that's right. That's right, because it's trustworthy. It's always right.
Exactly.
And
that's right.
Yeah.
100%. No, and again, I talk about it a lot, and I love this question, and I ask it to everybody all the time. And I do think though that science fiction has a lot to do with it, because it's always been presented to us as female as a society, just in films and everything. So, a lot of women think it's female as well. So, and the male ones have generally tended to be evil. You've got 2001, it kills everybody, and you've got Terminator runs around, and those sorts of things. So I think that is skewing it a little bit, but it's interesting. And so I know I ask these questions. So what are you going to name it then when you have your personal assistant?
Well, I mean, I'd probably go for something like Kylie, because what could be better than chatting to Kylie every day?
Awesome. Love it. I'm sure that won't get you in trouble at all. Excellent. Anything else for anything else? Is there anything else you think that you wanted to touch on that maybe we haven't talked about so far? Or
well, we could probably sit here and chat for the next week about this.
We can. I know we can.
I think that's probably everything today. So yeah, just thanks very much for having me on. And it's such a fascinating area, and I do think that from a public sector perspective there are some real opportunities here, and we've just got to keep talking to people who are doing research and other businesses, companies, people who are really embedded in the AI world, to really understand both the opportunities but also the pitfalls.
Excellent. Well, Dan, thanks for your time today. I'm glad you came on. I suspect that we will probably have more conversations in the future, and you're welcome to come on anytime if you have something in particular that's really bugging you or that you really want to talk about and bring to light. Let me know. I'm happy to have you back anytime.
That's a dangerous invitation, but yes.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Excellent. That's great.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you much, David. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
The Creatives with AI podcast, the spiritual home of creatives curious about AI and its role in their future.